Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. This week, I read The Perfect Couple by Elin Hilderbrand, released in June of 2018. This is a book about a wedding between the haves and the have-nots. Benji, our groom, represents the wealth in the haves, whereas Celeste really represents the working class here, along with the rest of her family. Now, the only problem here is, well, there's several problems, but the first problem is that the day of the wedding, the maid of honor, who is also the bride's only friend, is found dead. Okay, so, we're trying to figure out what happened there, but also we discover that the bride may or may not be in love with someone else. And also, the maid of honor may or may not be someone's side chick. So it's just a lot of messy nonsense, and I'm here for it. This is why I read these books. So let's get into it here. Now let's start with Elin Hilderbrand. So to date, she has released 28 novels, most if not all of which I believe are based in Nantucket. Makes a lot of sense since she has lived in Nantucket, Massachusetts since 1994. Now, her latest release is titled Swan Song. It was released this past June of 2024, and it is said that this is her last Nantucket-based novel. But one other thing I wanted to point out after reading through her website is that her first book, titled The Beach Club, was released in 2000. However, she didn't get her first #1 book until 2019 with The Summer of '69. So I just wanted to point out the fact that this woman has, first of all, succeeded in writing, completing, publishing a total of 28 novels, but it also took her years, almost 2 decades, to get a book that debuted at #1. Now, that's not to say that, her other books never went #1, but to debut at #1 is very, very big, I think, across all industries. So she clearly knows what she's doing. And this book is very clearly an example of that. This particular one, like I said earlier, was released in 2018, so it's a few years old, but it's experiencing this resurgence because it was recently adapted for a series on Netflix. So all of us are kind of revisiting or visiting this book for the first time. Now, The Perfect Couple, I would classify it as a no, that's not grammatically correct, a romance / murder mystery. But if you would force me to put it into anything, I would say that it's a murder mystery. And I'll touch on why it has a lot to do with the writing in just a moment here. Like I said, the physical setting here is Nantucket, Massachusetts. That's where the wedding is to take place. So that's where the rehearsal is taking place. That's where all of the guests are gathering to celebrate Benji and Celeste. It's also the physical setting of a few previous events that are discussed in the book. Benji's family owns a house there, so a lot of very relevant events take place in this area. Now, I would classify Nantucket. Now, this is someone who's never been there before, but just from seeing different things, different pictures and hot spots to go to, different restaurants, and then reading this book, I would say it's very, it's like a luxurious vacation spot. Like, you're definitely gonna relax here, and it's just laid back. The people that own homes here are people that, like, this is their second house. It's not just any basic vacation activities going on. Of course, there's hiking and there's boating and fishing, but it's elevated a little bit. And when you go out to these restaurants, you're not just going to get basic lobster. You're going to get the really, really good stuff. So I just kind of picture it as this very relaxing area, a nice place to read a book in, right? And I also want to shout out to Elin one more time here, because a lot of her books are released in the summer. And people will say like, oh, this is like a good summer read. And I think that's excellent marketing, first of all, because this 100% is a really great summer read. And so just releasing her Nantucket-based novels during that time period is like awesome. Now, before we go a little bit further, I want to touch on who the like core group of characters are and what their relationship to each other is. I'm not gonna list all of them, and I'm also not gonna talk about all of them because I don't want to spoil everything. But Celeste, of course, is the bride. Karen is her mother. Bruce is her father, and Merritt is her only friend / maid of honor. Benji is the groom. Thomas is his brother. Greer is his mother. Tag is his father, and Shooter is his best man and very, very good friend. Now, let's talk about the writing in this a little bit. So I would say that this is a semi-chronological timeline, which really means, generally speaking, the book from start to finish moves forward. However, there are a few times where we kind of jump back in time and we get these flashbacks to about the previous 2 years. I think 2 years was the earliest flashback that they did. And the flashbacks provide us with context and clues as we move along in the investigation. But generally speaking, this book is about the hours before and the hours of the day of the wedding. Now, the reason the flashbacks are so important is because it provides us context and clues along with who those memories are associated with, because there are perspective shifts in this book. So I love when books do this, because me personally, I just feel like you can tell one story, right? But it becomes several different stories when you start including different character perspectives. So it's like you have one big plot and one big thing happens, like the murder or death of Merritt. But then you start spending a day with this character, spending a few hours with this character, and you realize that there's several other things going on that could potentially add up to explain, the bigger, larger event. So we get told the story through several different characters. Of course, Celeste, I would argue that if there was like a main character here, it would be her, because the whole wedding, this is her wedding. All of the people there are either going to be like the family she's marrying into, or her family or her friends, or, whatever. But we also get the character of Nantucket, which I've kind of classified as a character. But I say that because, so if we're reading the book from Celeste's perspective, the title of the chapter will be Celeste, or it will be Karen. And, we read it through how they experience the day. But there are a couple of chapters where it just reads Nantucket, which I thought was interesting. However, as we all know, in murder mysteries, this physical setting, whether it's a house, a beach, a whatever, that area does have a story to tell within its own, and it's usually the most accurate one. But the one perspective we technically don't get is Merritt, who is the one who ends up dead. So we get her perspective via Nantucket's perspective, the very last chapter, which, you got to expect at this point. Why? It wouldn't be an interesting read, and it wouldn't be, to me, worth it if we were to know what happened before the rest of the book began. It kind of would just be like, okay, unless there was another twist. But you don't really get to hear from her after that day until the end of the chapter. Now, the inner dialogue specifically is very important when it comes to switching the perspectives, because it's an opportunity for the author to show the audience what that character is really thinking, right? So it's one thing where, let's just say you're just watching this from like a friend's perspective, you're watching two people have a conversation. You can hear and read what they're saying to each other in the dialogue. But when you're in one of the other characters and you know that this person's saying, oh yeah, I really like you, you're my best friend, but in their mind they're reflecting on it and they're thinking this person is really annoying or something like that. That didn't specifically happen in this book, but just to understand the color that some people have in their thoughts about different people. Of course, that speaks to motive, that speaks to relationships, that speaks to the character of that person, all of which is very important for us as an audience to piece together what exactly is going on here. So I think that was a very effective tool that Elin used here because, like, for example, I came to realize that there were several people that didn't really care for Merritt. It's not necessarily that she was a bad person or, she did this, she did that, but just even through the way that Karen, for example, who is the mother of the bride, when she would think to herself and reflect on Merritt, the thoughts weren't necessarily great. She didn't really have a positive outlook on her. She just kind of was like, okay, she's here, which is telling when that character turns up dead. So just little things like that. It's always good to have that in a murder mystery because we all know as an audience, this is a story about something that happened that we don't know what happened. We know not to trust everything that people are saying. So hearing what's going on inside of their head is very, very important, at least to me. So saying all that to say, this is written like an investigation. There are police officers and detectives that are involved in trying to piece together what happened here. And this book is written like that. It's like, okay, it's 5:27. We're sitting down with so-and-so. So-and-so says this. In my mind, I'm thinking, that doesn't make any sense, but let's try to push them. Like, this entire book reads like an investigation, which is very thrilling. And it reminded me a lot of Agatha Christie. Of course, I always compare my murder mysteries to Agatha Christie because to me, that's the standard, okay? But anyway, we'll get to those comparisons in a second. Okay, so usually this is the part where I would break down the characters and the themes separately. However, I felt like these characters represented the themes that I pulled out so well that I've just decided to mash them all together. So we're going to talk about the themes and then the characters that fall under those specifically. Again, I want to say I'm not going to hit on everyone because I want some stuff to remain like a little spoiler free, but also there's characters that are more relevant to what actually happened than others. So we're just going to hit on the big ones, the main ones here. Okay, so first of all, first theme is privilege. And whatever you're thinking, whatever you associate that word with, to me in this book, it's literally Benji and how he personifies the wealth and the status of his family and Nantucket. I think Nantucket could fall under this as well. Whereas his foil characters would be Celeste and Shooter. Now, more on that in just a second, but Benji is the kid that grew up with everything, had access to everything, a lot of connections, but he's also not written like an asshole, And that was refreshing because sometimes it's like, it's so clear who's supposed to be the bad guy. But in my opinion, Benji is someone who that's just how he was raised. It is what it is, Why wouldn't he, be thankful for the things that he's been afforded in life, or this one luxurious apartment, or he has a great job here and he's able to come to Nantucket with his family. He never came across as like, obnoxious or rude or like lazy or anything, but he just has access to these things. And the reason that's important is because Celeste does not. So when it comes to the foil character, they're so opposite. because they literally live in different worlds. Celeste comes from a working class family, a family that lived paycheck to paycheck. But also, Celeste isn't walking around like, poor old me, pity me, come save me. So they both very much stand in their own. They're both firm characters. And I especially like that because I couldn't classify who was right and who was wrong in this situation overall, and like the events that unfold towards the end of the book. I honestly was kind of rooting for both of them to get their stuff together. But anyway, so but a foil character just means it's someone that they're so opposite that when you put them up against each other, they're literally just like, they're just complete opposites. I don't want to define them too well, because like you should go into it with your own opinion. But also in the beginning of the book, when we're introduced to Benji, we're not introduced to his wealth and his privilege when they first meet. We're introduced to just a nice guy that likes Celeste, and that's it. And it goes from there. So anyway, now that brings us to my second theme here, which is desperation. If anything, this is the one I think that is very prevalent in the book as a whole. Several characters were desperate for something. We're running from something, running to something, literally. Celeste's family financial situation and the health of her mother, Karen, presented a very desperate situation, specifically for Celeste. So her mother, Karen, is dying from cancer, and this is after spending so much money and going into debt for the different medical tests and all types of other things. And her diagnosis is literally running in tandem with her relationship to Benji. Now, of course, remember, Benji has access to all this stuff, and to them, it's not a problem to spend X amount of money on medical stuff, because it's like, you need that, obviously. Whereas with Celeste and her family, like I said, they live paycheck to paycheck. So this has deeply upset the family morale, but also their finances, and it's created a very desperate situation. So Karen is on death's doorstep, and she's urging Celeste to marry, because of course she wants her to be happy, but also, girl, you need to marry into this very secure situation, because what we're going through right now, it's bleak. So you have this pressure coming from Karen's side to not only get married to Benji, but also for them to get married before she dies. Then you have Merritt, who, amongst everything that's going on, you find that she really just needs to be loved, or she wants to be loved. And she's not really, like I said before, what I've realized is that I don't know that she had a lot of great friends. She's described as this very social character who literally is like an influencer. So she has access to so many different circles, but she doesn't really have true connection like that outside of Celeste. That's the conclusion I drew. She has connections with other people, but it doesn't ever seem genuine. And, I don't think Merritt ever felt like she had that love that she wanted. So she's running around trying to fulfill that need. Shooter and his proximity to, okay, before I go any further, spoiler alert, I won't tell you everything, but I'm definitely going to spoil some stuff. So if you don't want to know, if you want to go in blind, stop listening right now, because I'm about to spoil some things. Okay. Shooter has this desperation because he is in proximity to something that he cannot have. Two things. He's in a proximity to this whole lifestyle of wealth, because technically his father, was in this circle, but he's also his father's side chick's son. So he's not like a legitimate part of the family. So he's always been on the outskirts, and he went to school with Benji. He's in, these circles, but he actually has to work very hard for it. So he's not relaxing about anything. Like, he's hustling actively to keep and stay in this life that it's all he's ever known. But also, Shooter is in love with Celeste. Talk about a curveball. And you know how that's finna go. Bad, okay? And one thing I will say about the writing in this book, is that you never really get any resolve or conclusion to this specific subplot of Benji, or of Shooter being in love with Celeste. We don't get a resolve on that, which I think is great, because the end of the book leaves a few things kind of just like, the end of the book is just the ending of one plot point. There are several that are left. Like, life, you gotta figure it out. Everything's not gonna be tied up neatly with a knot just because they figured out what happened to Merritt. So, and then the last desperate thing going on, there's some sketchy stuff happening with Thomas. And you pick up on this as well. This is a very subtle storyline that technically turns out to be very integral to the main plot, right? But you don't figure that out until very later. But Thomas is being blackmailed by Featherly, and Featherly is the one that's into some fraudulent activity. So when you're in proximity to all of the connections and the wealth that Thomas has, Featherly utilized that to her advantage, and now she got Thomas into some nonsense. So he's desperate to be rid of that entire situation and move on with his life. But I just want to say something. If he wasn't being messy in the first place, he wouldn't have any problems. And I'm gonna be honest with you, if Thomas wasn't being messy, we might not have had to read this book, because it wouldn't have happened. I'm just, Anyway, all right. So, there's one more theme that, I talked about privilege and I talked about desperation. What does that breed? Greed. Everyone's greedy for something. And let me just say, every romance affair is uncovered in this book, and there's a few of them. And then, of course, you have Featherly's fiscal fraud and whatever she's into, that nonsense. And that's a lesson for all of us. If you are in proximity to somebody that is doing some shady stuff or some messy stuff, it could potentially ruin your life, even if you're not involved in it, because you're on the outskirts of whatever they're doing. And this is a good lesson in that. Very subtle, because it's not the main thing, and nobody's investigating the fraudulent activity, and they're not really investigating the romance affair situations. They're really just focused on the murder. So, the review here, I'm going to be honest with you. I really enjoyed this story, but I did not like the resolution and what actually happened to Merritt, because I felt like it was anticlimactic, because I wanted someone to be responsible for it. And you could argue, and if anyone wants to argue about this, I have arguments prepared for both sides. You could argue that there are people directly responsible for what happened to Merritt, but you could also argue that it was an accident. And so finding out that it was the accident more so than the direct actions of other people, because even when you look at the events that led up to that, for example, one of the smaller events that came perfectly with other smaller events that led to Merritt having an accident and dying is that earlier in the day, one of the young waitresses had dropped glass on the ground, and later that night, Merritt cut her foot. And because she cut her foot, like, I forget exactly what happened, whether she went to go wash her foot in the water or something like that. And then and then, the situation happened, the accident happened, would you blame that person that dropped the glass earlier? There's several smaller actions that happened around Merritt dying that directly influenced that situation. But the reason I would say you can't pin it on those people is because, one, it wasn't intentional. And two, those people will never know that their events or those small actions that they made earlier in that night led to the death of Merritt. They'll never know. So how do you hold them responsible for it? Ultimately, it was declared an accident by the police and the investigation within the book. And I think we have to accept that as an audience. But I was like, man, I really wanted someone to be responsible for this, because these people are out here being crazy. They're just out here doing whatever they want. But, really, it was just a group of messy people. They weren't murderers. So, oh yeah, and it's funny because I put in my notes here, where's the resolution for Celeste? Honestly, I kept thinking to myself, she deserves a happy ending. She deserves a happy ending. But then I was like, does she? I mean, I don't want her to have the worst ending in the world, but for her to run off with her true love, I think that would have been out of character. And I'm glad that didn't happen, because she's not an impulsive person, and she's also not someone that just goes around knowing that her actions are going to hurt other people. But that was one I was like, oh, man. And then lastly, literally my last bullet point on here is a very good story of messy, wealthy people. This is Jerry Springer brought to fiction. Not quite that dramatic, but it's still a bunch of storylines about people who, for whatever reason, want more. Whether that's money, love, lust, gossip, revenge, all types of stuff, which makes a good murder mystery. Now, would I reread it? I don't think I would reread this. And let me tell you why. Because for me, I think I've gotten so accustomed to reading specifically murder mysteries that once you find out the ending, it's so jarring and eye-opening that you're like, I never even thought of that. Okay, so now I need to go back and read how I missed all those points, or read how, that conclusion now makes sense, and, reaffirm that that's what the conclusion is. But here it's like, once you realize that it was an accident, why? It's like the rest of the story becomes disconnected, because now you're investigating something that isn't a crime. So I would reread it for the subplots, the love triangles that were uncovered. But I just don't have the motivation to reread it. But I think it was a good book. And I could see how Netflix said that they should adapt this one. And I could easily see, them going through the process. Because I haven't seen the full series, but even if they were to do an episode per perspective, I think that would be super cool. The one thing I didn't like about this book, though, was reading Karen's parts, because selfishly, that was really depressing. It was depressing reading the perspective of a woman that knew she was going to die. And on top of that, was desperate for her child to feel secure financially and just with a new family and all that. That was hard. It was very hard to read those parts, because it was not a great feeling. But that's a testament to the writing of Elin. So, now the Netflix adaptation, which was released in this past September, so it's been out for about 4 months now. Yeah, 3 or 4 months. Let me just say something. I turned on the Netflix series immediately after I finished reading the book, and I watched 65 seconds and I was done. I couldn't do it. But I'm going to watch it eventually, and I think that what needs to happen is that I need to do an episode separately on adaptations, why they succeed, why they sometimes alienate readers. and all of that stuff. Not to say that's what this one did, because again, I only saw 65 seconds of the adaptation. I need to go back and look at it fully. But I think what happens is with books, once you've decided how a character looks, how they act, the tone of their voice, you know, the movements of them, and then you see it on screen and you realize, oh, like I wasn't in charge of like of putting this together, so it's not gonna match what I expected. And also the people that are in charge of bringing it to life on screen, there's so many different hands in it. So the script, first of all, changes, even just slightly. Then you have the directors and the film studios or the production companies that say they want this character to be this way, or maybe they want to change the motivation, or maybe they want to change the actions of a character. And then you have the actors come in. And even one thing I've learned is, even if an actor decides that, I'm not motivated by money, I think I'm motivated by lust, and they play the character that way, it's going to completely change what you have in your head. So I think I need time to get my versions out of my head and then watch the Netflix series on its own. And then we'll compare and contrast, because I just literally, the first few seconds, I was like, that is not how Merritt or Celeste acted in my head, you know? And it's funny because I kept getting them mixed up, because there's also a name change from the book to the series, which I will cover when I do my adaptation episode. And sometimes those things are relevant to the plot and, you know, all that other stuff. But I kept getting them confused because I felt like they were opposites in my head. Like they acted the opposite way than what they were doing on screen. So I don't know. I'll go back and rewatch it. I think either way, it's going to be a good watch, though. I do not know what the ending of the series is, so we'll see if that will brighten my review a little bit more. But I will say that this book is definitely worth the read. I ended up downloading it on Kindle. That's why I don't have a physical copy with me right now, because I gave it to my friend. But I had the physical copy, and then I also had the Kindle version because I read a few chapters at night, and it's just easier to do it like through the app. But yeah, so I'll always have this book. I thought it was good, and I definitely will look into reading more pieces from Elin, and I hope that we'll continue to get stuff from her. I think we will. If she's released books consistently for over 2 decades, I don't think she's going to stop. I think she's just going to switch location. So we'll see how that goes. But until then, thank you so much for watching another episode. I will see you soon. Thanks.